In the early hours of a tense week in global politics, a warning from Tehran captured international attention. A senior Iranian official issued a stark message aimed directly at former US President Donald Trump, cautioning him to be careful not to get eliminated. The statement came amid an expanding confrontation between Iran, the United States and Israel, a conflict that has already shaken global energy markets and raised fears of a wider regional war. What began as a series of strategic strikes and counterstrikes has quickly evolved into one of the most dangerous geopolitical crises of the decade. Oil tankers have been attacked near the Strait of Hormuz. Missile and drone strikes have spread across the Gulf region. Global leaders are calling for restraint. And behind the scenes, analysts are asking a deeper question. How did a conflict that was supposed to deter Iran end up triggering such a volatile backlash? To understand the current moment, it helps to step back and look at the long and complicated history of USAT. Iran tensions. The roots of the rivalry stretch back more than 4 decades. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Iran's new Islamic government broke ties with Washington and established itself as a fierce opponent of US influence in the Middle East. The seizure of the US embassy in Tehran and the 444-day hostage crisis permanently altered relations between the two countries. Over the years, the confrontation has played out through sanctions, covert operations, proxy conflicts and diplomatic negotiations. One of the central issues has been Iran's nuclear program. Western governments have long suspected that Tehran was trying to develop nuclear weapons, while Iranian leaders insist their program is intended for civilian energy and scientific purposes. In 2015, an international agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action attempted to limit Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. But the deal was deeply controversial in US and Quain's politics, and tensions returned when Washington withdrew from it during Trump's earlier presidency. Since then, the cycle of pressure and retaliation has intensified. Sanctions crippled Iran's economy. Regional proxy conflicts continued in places like Iraq, Syria and Lebanon. And military incidents at sea and in the air kept the possibility of open war alive. The current crisis accelerated dramatically in 2025 and early 2026. A major turning point came when US and Israeli forces launched strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and military infrastructure. According to US officials, the goal was to significantly degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and prevent the country from moving closer to building a weapon. American leaders described the operation as a necessary step to protect regional security. Some policymakers argued that Iran had crossed red lines by expanding uranium enrichment and supporting armed groups across the Middle East. But the operation also carried enormous risks. Iran's leadership warned that any attack on its territory would be met with retaliation, and that is exactly what happened. Within days, the confrontation expanded into what analysts now describe as a broader regional conflict. Iran launched waves of ballistic missiles and drones targeting US military positions and allied facilities across the Gulf region. Some of these strikes reached Kuwait, where dozens of missiles and drones were intercepted and several casualties were reported. Other attacks targeted infrastructure in Oman, including ports and shipping routes, highlighting how the conflict could quickly disrupt global trade. Meanwhile, maritime tensions intensified around one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through it. When Iran threatened to restrict or halt shipping through the strait, energy markets reacted instantly. Oil prices surged, shipping routes were disrupted, and governments around the world began preparing for potential economic shocks. For many observers, this moment illustrated a key reality of modern geopolitics. Even limited conflict in the Persian Gulf can ripple across the global economy within hours. The situation became even more explosive after reports that Iran's supreme leader had been killed during the opening phase of the conflict. The loss of such a central figure in Iran's political system created both uncertainty and anger inside the country. Rather than collapsing, however, Iran's military structure proved resilient. Analysts note that the country's security system is decentralized, with multiple layers of command within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and other institutions. That structure allowed Tehran to continue coordinating retaliatory attacks despite heavy bombardment. As the fighting intensified, political rhetoric also escalated. President Trump publicly warned Iran that any attempt to block oil shipments would trigger an even stronger American response. At the same time, Iranian officials accused the United States of attempting regime change and vowed that those responsible would face consequences. It was in this context that the controversial warning directed at Trump appeared. A prominent Iranian security figure issued a message implying that the US leader himself could become a target if threats against Iran continued. While such statements can sometimes be rhetorical, they reflect the intensity of the current confrontation. The remark quickly circulated through international media, fueling debate about how far the conflict might escalate. Yet the crisis is not simply about two countries trading threats. It involves a complex web of regional alliances and rivalries. Israel is deeply involved, viewing Iran as its most serious security threat. Israeli leaders have repeatedly warned that Iran must not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons capability. The Israeli military has carried out numerous operations targeting Iranian infrastructure and allied groups across the region. For the United States, support for Israel and the desire to prevent nuclear proliferation are key strategic priorities. At the same time, Washington must balance those objectives against the risks of a prolonged war in the Middle East. For Iran, the conflict is framed as resistance against foreign aggression and Western pressure. Iranian officials argue that decades of sanctions and military threats have forced them to build defensive capabilities. Other regional actors are watching closely. Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have complicated relationships with both Washington and Tehran. They rely on security partnerships with the United States, but also fear that escalating conflict could devastate their economies and infrastructure. Meanwhile, global powers like China and Russia are assessing how the crisis could reshape the international order. China depends heavily on energy imports from the Persian Gulf, while Russia sees opportunities and risks in the shifting balance of power. Beyond the military and political dimensions, the humanitarian cost of the conflict is also growing. Civilian casualties have been reported in multiple locations, and infrastructure damage threatens essential services in affected regions. Thousands of people inside Iran have reportedly been killed or wounded in the fighting so far, while retaliatory strikes across the Gulf have endangered civilians and foreign workers. At the same time, the economic consequences are spreading worldwide. When oil prices rise sharply, the effects reach far beyond the energy sector. Transportation costs increase, food prices rise, and inflation pressures intensify in countries already dealing with economic challenges. Airlines may cancel or reroute flights to avoid conflict zones. Shipping companies may charge higher insurance premiums for vessels travelling through risky waters. And governments may release strategic oil reserves to stabilise markets. This is why the Strait of Hormuz remains such a critical flashpoint. Even a partial disruption of traffic through the strait could remove millions of barrels of oil from daily global supply. The crisis has also triggered intense debate within the United States itself. Supporters of the military campaign argue that confronting Iran was necessary to stop nuclear proliferation and protect regional allies. They believe strong action can deter future threats. Critics, however, warn that the strategy could backfire. Some lawmakers and analysts say that military strikes risk pushing Iran to accelerate its nuclear ambitions or expand proxy warfare across the region. Others worry that the conflict could evolve into a prolonged war with unpredictable consequences. The challenge for policymakers is that each option carries significant risks. Escalating the conflict might damage Iran's military capabilities, but could also provoke wider retaliation. Pursuing diplomacy might reduce tensions, but could be politically difficult after such a dramatic confrontation. This tension between deterrence and diplomacy has defined US-Iran relations for decades. Another important dimension of the crisis is internal politics within Iran itself. In late 2025, Wide's Speaker Pre-ad protests erupted across the country amid economic hardship and currency collapse. Demonstrators demanded political change and protested rising prices and government policies. These protests created additional pressure on Iran's leadership even before the current military confrontation began. Some analysts believe that external conflict can sometimes strengthen governments facing internal dissent by rallying national unity. Others argue that prolonged war can deepen economic suffering and intensify political instability. The outcome remains uncertain. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue behind the scenes. International organisations, including the United Nations, have urged all sides to de-escalate and return to negotiations. Several countries have offered to mediate talks aimed at preventing the conflict from expanding further. However, diplomacy is complicated by the rapid pace of events on the ground. Missile strikes, naval incidents, and political statements can quickly undermine fragile negotiations. The broader global implications of this crisis are difficult to overstate. First, it highlights how interconnected the world's energy system remains. A conflict in one narrow maritime corridor can influence fuel prices from Asia to Europe to North America. Second, it demonstrates the risks of military escalation in a region filled with overlapping alliances, proxy forces, and strategic infrastructure. Third, it raises questions about the future of nuclear diplomacy. If negotiations fail and tensions continue to rise, the international community could face renewed debates about nuclear proliferation and deterrence. Finally, the crisis underscores how personal political dynamics can influence global security. Statements directed at individual leaders, including the recent warning aimed at Trump, show how geopolitical rivalry can spill into highly personalized rhetoric. Whether these words remain symbolic or escalate into more dangerous actions will depend on decisions made in the coming weeks. For now, the conflict remains fluid. Military operations continue. Diplomatic channels remain open but fragile. And the world is watching closely as one of the most consequential geopolitical confrontations of the decade unfolds. The central question is whether the crisis will stabilize or spiral further. History shows that wars in the Middle East rarely follow simple trajectories. Conflicts can expand unexpectedly, draw in new actors, and reshape alliances in ways that few predicted at the outset. Yet history also shows that diplomacy, even after intense conflict, can sometimes open pathways toward de-escalation. For global leaders, the challenge is to navigate this delicate balance between strength and restraint. As the confrontation between the United States, Iran, and the allies continues to evolve, the stakes extend far beyond any single political figure or military operation. Energy markets, international security, nuclear diplomacy, and regional stability are all tied to what happens next. And in a world already facing multiple geopolitical crises, the outcome of this confrontation could shape global politics for years to come. For now, the message from the crisis is clear. The conflict between Washington and Tehran has entered a new and unpredictable phase, and the world is watching closely to see where it leads next. This has been Global Briefing. Stay informed, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next analysis.